The New Orleans Saints have spent a lot of time this offseason building forward momentum, trying to get back to their glory days, and the running back room is the perfect example. We got all that and a little bit of lanyard for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Saints, your daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks so much, as always, for making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget, you can subscribe and follow for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss the latest episode. You can always continue the conversation one-on-one with me over at joinsubtext.com/Locked On Saints. As always, I'm your host, Ross Jackson, at Ross Jackson Nola on Twitter, your New Orleans Saints expert, credential member of the media. You can find me as the senior writer and reporter over at Saints News Network, Sports Illustrated's Fan Nation site, covering the New Orleans Saints every Tuesday over in the Locked On NFL podcast, and here with you every single Monday through Friday on Locked On Saints. In today's episode of Locked On Saints, brought to you by our friends over at Birddogs. Head over to birddogs.com/Locked On NFL today, and they're going to throw in a free custom Birddogs Yeti-style tumbler with your purchase. I'm going to tell you more about them later, but let's take a look at what's on tap for today's show. We're going to kind of get you caught up with the news from the week, which really just kind of centers around the Superdome, but also the training camp dates. They're out, so we'll break all of those down thanks to Jeff Duncan over at NOLA.com. We've also got a look at Pete Werner. Will he be back to form in 2023 based on what was the beginning of a very promising 2022. But first, I want to start off with the New Orleans Saints running back room. We've discussed their running back room a few times here on the show, but I kind of wanted to take us back thanks to a great question from Gage over at the Locked On Saints Facebook group around how close the New Orleans Saints are with this present running back room to previous successful running back rooms that the Saints have had. And I think success at the running back position for the New Orleans Saints has changed over time. You go back to 2009 through 2014-15 or so, you didn't really see 1,000-yard rushers for the New Orleans Saints. Not often. You saw a lot of 700, 600-yard rushers that also had 600, 500 receiving yards, right? So you saw the 1,000-yard all-purpose guys, Darren Sproles, Pierre Thomas, even, Alvin Kamara early, all of that. And even Alvin Kamara throughout his career, like the guy still doesn't have a 1,000-yard season, but he technically doesn't need to have one in this system for it to be successful. And that's been proven over the course of years and years and years and years. And so when you look at the New Orleans Saints and you look at the success that they could potentially have with this running back room, specifically focusing on the top three, but we won't rule everybody out. Alvin Kamara, Jamaal Williams, and then of course rookie Kendre Miller, who they drafted out of TCU. And then you imagine that there will be some fourth running back that will contribute. And when I say fourth running back that will contribute, I don't mean a fullback. I mean legitimately a fourth running back that will contribute. And there's two reasons to consider that. The first of which is that Alvin Kamara is possibly going to miss some time here during the 2023 season, depending upon how his ongoing legal situation either comes to a close July 31st or doesn't. We'll have to see how that whole trial goes and how all of that ends up. But there's that part. But even when the Saints have had their guys up at the top when it comes to running back, there's always been sort of that fourth guy that gets the 200 yards here, the 100 yards here, in a season, but has some big 50-yard breakaway run at some point randomly in a game. Think back to Dwayne Washington, 2017 against the Bills, right? So, those types of games still have an opportunity to take place for the New Orleans Saints. And so I look at right now, maybe Kirk Merritt at that running back 4 spot, but we shouldn't sleep on guys like Ellis Merriweather and some of the others that the Saints are getting a look at. So I think that the Saints have done a good job building up their running back room, but it does help to look back to the past a little bit to remind ourselves what success looks like in this offense in the run game, because it's not the same as the New York Giants or the Philadelphia Eagles or the, any of these other run-heavy teams that are, the Tennessee Titans, right, that have these quintessential 1,000-yard rushers, the Cleveland Browns and Nick Chubb, all that, and then maybe one complimentary piece like a Kareem Hunt or otherwise. But for the most part, for the Saints, It's really about, can you get 3 guys to contribute? Can you get 2 guys to contribute? That's really what you're looking for. So let's look back real quick at 2009. This, of course, was a Super Bowl winning team. The top 3 rushers in terms of yards were Pierre Thomas, Mike Bell, and Reggie Bush. Now, Reggie Bush had 70 attempts for 390 yards, but he also 390 rushing yards, but he also added 47 receptions for 335 receiving yards. Similarly, for Pierre Thomas, 147 carries, which actually wasn't the number 1 ranking on the list, for 793, which did lead the team that season. But he also had 39 receptions for 302 receiving yards. So you see the versatility between those two. So what was Mike Bell's role? Well, Mike Bell actually had the most carries that season with 172 carries, but just 654 yards. He had a 3.8 yard average, but also had 5 rushing touchdowns. So what was his role? He was the between the tackles short yardage guy. So if you think about this, and you think about how Alvin Kamara, Jamaal Williams, and Kendre Miller could fit similar roles. I'm not comparing the players. I'm just saying how they can fit similar roles to the 2009 brand of what the New Orleans Saints running back room looked like. You could pretty easily see Alvin Kamara being the guy with 793 rushing yards and then also adding 302 receiving yards. You would imagine that would be light work for Alvin Kamara. But let's say he misses 6 games. How does that impact things like that? Then you've got Mike Bell, who maybe is the Jamaal Williams in this situation, 654 rushing yards, 3.8 yards per attempt is probably a little low for Jamaal Williams' liking, especially all the different things he's going to be asked to do here in New Orleans. But it's a safe floor, right? It's a very, very safe floor for you to look at and say, okay, I could see how Jamaal Williams fits that Mike Bell role. Then you've got a guy like Kendre Miller coming in as a rookie, just like Reggie Bush was coming in. This was 3 years into Reggie Bush's time, but coming in as a young player who only had 70 carries, but still racked up 5.6 yards per carry and still had 5 touchdowns. Here's the touchdown count in terms of rushing touchdowns for these 3 players. 6 for Pierre Thomas, 5 for Mike Bell, 5 for Reggie Bush. Then you had Pierre Thomas add 2 receiving touchdowns as well as 3 receiving touchdowns for Reggie Bush. So you could see that in the modern era, I guess 2009 is still the modern era of football. But getting into 2023, you would expect to see more scores, you would expect to see more yards, you would expect to see all that. But the archetype of those players, which has persisted throughout the history of the New Orleans Saints offense, even following 2009, you look at the 2011 season, for instance, and they had very much the same type of share. You had Darren Sproles with 603 rushing yards, Pierre Thomas with 562, and then Mark Ingram with 474. So you can see where the Saints have continued sort of this trifecta of running back progression and running back production and how it's helped them in the past. Again, 2012, 602 rushing yards for Mark Ingram, 473 for Pierre Thomas, 244 for Darren Sproles, and it goes on and on and on. You can look at the 2013 season and see similar numbers as well between Pierre Thomas, Mark Ingram, but then this time it's Kyrie Robinson and Darren Sproles both over 220 rushing yards, and then adding the receiving yards and receptions and things like that. So you can see where the Saints can build off of a mold that they are very, very familiar with and continue to maximize these running backs as a committee while also featuring Alvin Kamara. But the fun thing about 2023, and again, we have to always caveat that Alvin Kamara might miss some games here, is that if the Saints have all 3 of those guys, featuring Alvin Kamara in the passing game as well as the run game doesn't end up taking away from what you can do with Jamaal Williams, potentially Kendre Miller, and then maybe a guy like Kirk Merritt who finds a way to contribute here and there. Maybe a guy like Lynn Bowden who finds a way to contribute here and there. Maybe it's Ellis Merriweather, whatever. There are lots of opportunities for the New Orleans Saints to have a lot of fun with this running backs core, and they have a lot of different examples of how to utilize those archetypes to build off of. And hey, Pete Carmichael was there for all of it, so he should be able to help translate right away. And I'll tell you what, Joel Thomas was also a big part of a bunch of this too. One of the things that he told me when he and I spoke during OTAs, is that a lot of people think that Kendre Miller can't catch passes, but they said the same thing about Mark Ingram. They said the same thing about Latavius Murray, and look at what we did with them. Now the Saints will intend to do the same thing with Kendre Miller. All right, so lots of fun stuff for that running back room, but a lot of fun stuff over on the defensive side as well, including whether or not Pete Werner can return to form, because a lot of people tend to forget that he was on a Pro Bowl trajectory until his injury. Can he get back to that in 2023? We got all that and a little bit of lanyap coming up for you as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is sponsored by Birddogs, the absolute leader for me when it comes to, well, what's about to be my entire closet. I mean, I love my Birddogs clothes. I've got joggers, I've got shorts. I'm working on getting some polos as well. They are fantastic. They have great like anti-stink sweat wicking fabric. I don't even know what wicking is, but I'm so glad that Birddogs uses whatever they use for their wicking. It's a science that I don't need to understand, but it's absolutely one that I appreciate. That give me that nice look. I've been running, all right? My thighs are looking fine. I want to show them off. I need my Hoochie Daddy shorts, and Birddogs is a place to get that done. So you can go check them out today over at birddogs.com/lockedonnfl. That's the spot to go. birddogs.com/lockedonnfl. You're going to get a free Yeti-style tumbler with your order. That's birddogs.com/lockedonnfl for that free Yeti-style tumbler. You won't want to take your Birddogs off. We promise you that. All right, family, continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. Thanks again, as always, for making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget, everydayers, we're here with you every single Monday through Friday. So we'll be right back with you on Monday, right after the weekend. And as we get to Monday, we're going to start looking at some questions over the course of the offseason, the biggest questions that the Saints have left to answer. And we're going to lead off there, as well as getting you caught up with anything that happens with the Saints over the course of the weekend as well. Here on today's show, the next thing I want to look at are the linebackers, because there's a lot of excitement for the New Orleans Saints defense. And I think the linebacker room is one that probably has a lot of question marks, depending upon who you're talking to. People either tell you that the linebacker spot is where the Saints need to have the biggest need, or the defensive line is where they have the biggest need. I would say the front seven is where they have the biggest need. I think they can use some help there. But the Saints do have a potential perennial Pro Bowler on defense in linebacker Pete Werner. And I think maybe people have started to forget that a little bit. For instance, Pro Football Focus ranked the New Orleans Saints as having, I think it was the fourth best linebacker duo in the NFL, or fourth best linebacker group in the NFL. And so that was led by, of course, Demario Davis, who has been phenomenal in all of his seasons. He had career highs in sacks last season. He was he's been an Iron Man for the team. He's an emotional defensive leader. He's a film room leader. He's a locker room leader. Like, he does everything. But one of the things that they mentioned was that, like, with the departure of Kaden Elliss, the starting role next to Demario Davis goes to Pete Werner. And I can't stress how incorrect that assumption is, because Pete Werner was always going to be the starter. They were just going to find more ways to mix Kaden Elliss in. That's why Kaden Elliss didn't stay in New Orleans, because he played himself into a starting role, and there was no starting role available for him with the Saints. He wanted to be with the Saints. You'll remember he was on this very show years ago and said, if I could sign a lifetime contract with the New Orleans Saints, I would sign it right now. And that's cool, but he wasn't getting the opportunity that he deserved in New Orleans, because at best he was going to be the third linebacker or a rotational linebacker. Now he gets to have a full-time role over in Atlanta, and I do hope that it goes well for him outside of the 2 games that he plays against his former team. But for Pete Werner, we shouldn't forget that he was the best linebacker in the NFL. He was leading the NFL in tackles, 71 tackles through his first 8 games last season, before that injury hit him in week 9, in a game where he also had three tackles. Now, you can look beyond that. He was also the player that continuously forced issues for opposing offenses, whether it be by punching, footballs out, recovering fumbles, knocking passes away in pass defense, making tackles as, quarterbacks tried to scramble free on a 3rd and 15 and everything. Geno Smith, I think in the Seattle Seahawks game, is a good example of that. I mean, he was outstanding all season. And so this idea that the departure of Kaden Elliss means that Pete Werner gets the starting role is just wildly off, because Pete Werner is going to be the starter. Now, the question is, or was always going to be the starter. Now, the question is, with the ankle injury that he was dealing with that kind of had him in and out of the lineup toward the latter half of 2023, or 2022, is he going to be able to get back to form in 2023? I'll tell you that watching him during OTAs and mini camps, he looks as good as ever. He moves extremely well. He's super fluid. He's not limping. He doesn't seem to have any issues with that ankle or anything like that. So that's all good news for the New Orleans Saints. But why is it important that Pete Werner returns to sort of that high level play that he had at the beginning of 2022? And there's a current reason, and then there's a future reason for it as well. The current reason is that maybe when you have a little bit of concern around the Saints linebacker room, it's not necessarily the starters, right? You trust Demario Davis, you trust Pete Werner, even though the national folks might not. But it's the depth, right? What happens if Pete Werner has another injury? What happens if Demario Davis needs to be spelled? Who's the guy that comes in their role? Because it's not Zach Bond. I know that Zach Bond is the guy that, or it shouldn't be Zach Bond. I know he's the guy that they bring in as the strong side linebacker to, help and run defense and rush the passer. That's where Zach Bond is maximized. That's where he can give you his best, is as a pass rusher. Don't put him out there, in coverage until you've seen the progression there. Don't put him in a place where he's got this great skill set that's not being utilized because you're using him over here. So you have to find somebody else to play that coverage role. And right now that looks like DeMarco Jackson. DeMarco Jackson's getting, he's the second year linebacker out of App State, and he's getting a lot of opportunity. They're giving him, the communication device in his helmet, the green dot helmet. So he's calling the shots during mini camps and OTAs and things like that. So you're getting to look at him at Mike. But the will spot or the weak side linebacker spot where there's maybe lesser offensive players and things like that stacked up before the snap, that's really the coverage role. And so who's the person that comes in behind Pete Werner? I think that there's a little bit of confusion, not confusion, but there's a little bit left unanswered there. Will that be guys like Andrew Dowell or Ty Summers or Nephi Sewell that can win that spot? Or you've got rookies like Anthony Orji, or you've got, of course, Nick Anderson from right here in the Saints' backyard at Tulane. And so Pete Werner, the reason why it's important for him to return to form in 2022 or 2023 is that you don't really know who the guy is behind him just yet. The long-term thing is that he's eventually going to be the guy in place of Demario Davis. Like, we have to start talking about the fact that Demario Davis maybe has a few years left, and when he hangs up what will be illustrious cleats, and he'll have his argument for a lot of, let's just call them post-career awards, I think, that becomes Pete Werner's unit at that point. And so who is the guy that, or how much can we see him take on that leadership role, begin to show, hey, this is my unit now and everything. And that starts with a good performance in 2023. So if Pete Werner, even though other folks might be forgetting about him, there's no need to be forgetting for us to forget about what it is that he can bring to this team. He's a sideline to sideline type of guy, does everything well. He's kind of one of those like master of everything types. He can rush the passer. He's great in run defense. He's a solid tackler at the second level. He can cover. He can make plays on the football. He's got awareness to punch the ball out. He's got a nose for forcing turnovers. He's got a nose for recovering fumbles as well, something that the Saints lost years ago with Von Bell. And so, you look at where Pete Werner can contribute, and really the answer is kind of yes, everywhere. And so seeing him get back to form in 2023, like we saw at the beginning of 2022, even though very conveniently forgotten about elsewhere, would be massive for the New Orleans Saints over on the defensive side. So I just wanted to take a look at Pete Werner and kind of see like, okay, where's the gauge on him right now outside of New Orleans? And it genuinely shocked me that this guy who was leading the NFL in tackles last year, who was getting TFLs, who was making big plays, who was forcing big turnovers, who was making plays for the Saints defense, all that, just kind of overshadowed by the last few weeks that he ended up missing. And that's unfortunate. But it goes to show you that this league is all about what have you done for me lately. And so 2023 becomes really important for Pete Werner before he starts looking back in any rearview mirrors or anything like that. All right, coming up next, we're going to get you all caught up with the New Orleans Saints training camp dates and get you caught up with everything that you missed and need to know from this week around your New Orleans Saints. Got that coming up for you as we continue on to wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Let's Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. Wrapping up today's episode of Locked On Saints with our weekly Friday installment. In case you missed it, this one's going to kind of be like a big in case you missed it, because really what we want to look at is training camp dates, off-season dates, stuff like that. Jeff Duncan over at NOLA.com reported all of these dates. So just want to share them with you so you know what's going on and what to expect when it comes to New Orleans Saints training camp, preseason, joint practices, all that. We'll also take a look at a couple of other big pieces. So let's start off with a look at the dates for training camp for the New Orleans Saints. So the New Orleans Saints will open up training camp kind of for themselves amongst their veteran reporting day on July 24th. We're just a little bit over a month, like a month and a day away from the New Orleans Saints veterans reporting at training camp. The day after that, the 25th, would be their conditioning test. This is a pretty usual situation to where everybody kind of does all their conditioning tests and everything on that day. So, that will be an important day, because if anybody doesn't pass those conditioning tests, then that becomes a little bit of a thing, and you're going to see some guys working off to the side to build up and all that. But we'll see how that goes. I think from what we saw at OTAs and mini camps and how many people were present and how many people were working and all those other things, I think that everybody should be fine, but we'll see. 2026. July 26th would be the first practice in Jersey. So July 26th is the day on your calendar that you want to circle for, all of us tweeting out updates after practice and letting you know who was there, who wasn't, who made big plays, who didn't, interviews, all that other stuff. So that's the date that you're going to want to be paying attention to, July 26th. That's going to be a light day, no contact, just everybody out there in jerseys kind of getting everything together, getting started. 2 days later, July 28th, they'll then move into shells, so things get a little bit more entertaining at that point. That'll be July 28th. And then July 31st, just a few days later, will be the first practice in pads. Now, keep in mind, the first practice in pads is usually a very fun day. First practice in pads will also be July 31st, though. That's the same day as Alvin Kamara's trial date for his outstanding legal situation. So that's a big day in a couple of different ways for the New Orleans Saints. Will that trial take place on that day? Will it be continued and continue to be postponed down the road? All those other things. So there's lots of question marks around what that means for Alvin Kamara and the New Orleans Saints, but also sort of you're looking at where they're going to be in terms of practicing in pads and all that. Then they go from that to just different usual practice schedule throughout the rest of those weeks, leading up to the August 13th home preseason game against the Kansas City Chiefs at noon. That will be right here in our backyard at the Superdome. Now, August 17th and 18th, so just a few days after that, the very next week after the Saints have that game against the Kansas City Chiefs, they will they will be practicing with the Chargers in Costa Mesa, California. So if you're a New Orleans Saints fan in Los Angeles or in the Orange County area, keep an eye out, because those might be open to the public. In fact, I think they are, but just keep an eye out and make sure. But that will be an opportunity to see the Saints in practices. Again, that's August 17th and 18th. Joint practices are great. This is an opportunity for, after 3-4 weeks of practicing across from the same guys that use the same moves, who do the same things, that they finally get to go up against unfamiliar opponents that do unfamiliar things for a couple of days. That leads up to the Chargers playoff game in SoFi Stadium. That will be on the 20th. At 6:05 p.m. Just so you know, my travel schedule for that, I will be there for the joint practices on the 17th and 18th, and then I'm coming back, and then I think I'm going to do a live watch party for the, like we can all jump in. I'll make something somewhere where we can all jump in and watch the game together, or I'll stream while the game's playing. We'll have some fun with it. That'll be a little bit of a fun day. Then the following week, just a couple days later, the Saints will host joint practices again, but this time with the Houston Texans in Metairie. So this will be back here in New Orleans. August 24th and 25th will be those practices ahead of the August 27th game against the Houston Texans. Really interesting to me that the Houston Texans and the New Orleans Saints will have joint practices together. They'll have a preseason game against one another, and they'll have a regular season game against one another as well. So I was talking with Eric Asher on the radio not too long ago about this, that it kind of feels like there might be some bad blood between these teams by the time that they get to the game. So this is going to be a really interesting through line to watch. New Orleans Saints, Dennis Allen, D'Amico Ryans, and the Houston Texans, and kind of how that relationship between the players goes over the course of joint practices, preseason, and regular season. Like most seasons, you see other players one time, and that's when you play against them in the season if they're on your schedule. The Saints are going to see these boys like 4 different days throughout the year. So we'll see how all of that goes. And then just to keep in mind too, they will have that August 27th preseason game against the Houston Texans. It's the final preseason game for the Saints schedule. August 29th is going to be the roster cut down to 53 players. They go straight from 90 to 53. Now we'll see if they make some cuts in between to kind of make things a little bit easier on themselves. But otherwise, the expectation is that rosters are going from 90 to 53 across the NFL on August 29th as the preseason officially comes to a close. So that's your offseason schedule for the New Orleans Saints. Another thing that I kind of wanted to shout out here in case you missed it is the New Orleans Saints are going through these renovations at the Superdome. And if you haven't been following the Saints stories on that, which contain concept art and everything that give you a little bit of a look at what it is that they're doing with the Superdome, it looks really cool. All the new club spaces, all the new sort of features, everything. So there's an Envision the Future series that you can find over on NewOrleansSaints.com. It's got a whole bunch of the concept art so you can see what all the renovations look like and everything. I know that the circumvention of the Superdome has been complicated for some folks and things like that and all the different things that are going on, but it looks like when these renovations are done, it's going to be well worth it in terms of what the New Orleans Saints are going to be doing. In case you missed it, Cam Jordan hasn't changed his mind. He still wants to be a New Orleans Saint for his entire career. He told the New Orleans Saints website, I've said it plenty of times, whether I play 15 or 16 years, I want it to be here. And just a reel in case you missed it, because it's been a little while, Saints general manager Mickey Loomis was on WWL, it was SiriusXM, part of our partners actually here on the Locked On Podcast Network, and he mentioned that they want to get a contract done with Cam and that they want him to finish his career in New Orleans. And they believe that he's going to be a Hall of Famer and they want him to be a New Orleans Saints Hall of Famer and all that. And so really cool stuff to just see that continue. Cam Jordan also hosted his 5th annual C3 youth camp as well. So you see him continuing to give to the community. He's not the only one. Jameis Winston held a camp. Tyrann Mathieu spoke at a Black Leadership Conference, Black Youth Leadership Conference and all that. So you can continue to see the Saints not only connecting with one another during OTAs, mini camps and stuff like that, but continuing to find ways to connect with the community. That's always been one of the most important parts about this New Orleans Saints team is their relationship with the community that they represent. And you can see in guys like Tyrann Mathieu, Jameis Winston, Cam Jordan, and many others, that drive is absolutely there on a player-to-player basis as opposed to just an organization to community basis as well. So really, really cool stuff to see there. All right, y'all. That does it for today, and that does it for this week of Locked On Saints. Remember, over the course of the weekend, I'm going to be working on a film study for Alante Taylor versus Paulson Adebo. If you want to see that, head over to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnSaints today. Get joined up. That'll be ready probably around Tuesday. I'll probably work on it over the course of the weekend and try to have it ready for about Tuesday. But I'm going to put a lot of hard work into it. So we'll see. We'll see how I do. But we are going to do some film studies over there for that. And as always, I appreciate y'all 100% for being here and for continuing to make Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Coming up on Monday, we're taking a look at the biggest questions that remain for the New Orleans Saints offseason. So let me know if you have some of those questions, and I might fold them into the show. So let me know what your biggest questions are that remain for this New Orleans Saints team. Appreciate you as always, y'all, for making Locked On Saints a part of your day, a part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. As always, if you see me, say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on Twitter at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how you're momming them. And trust Who Dat Nation, I'll holla at you.